Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. How do you follow up a film like A Hard Day's Night? Humorous, naturalistic, but surreal. A film that perfectly encapsulated and dramatized the unreality that the Beatles faced on a day-to-day basis. So it would make sense to follow it up with a similar formula. Maybe this time though, following the boys on a world tour, and all the shenanigans that ensue. So there you have it, the next Beatles film. Wait, what? That's not it? A ritualistic ring? An Indian cult composed of English actors in brownface? Look, Help is not without its charms. The plot, admittedly, is pretty rough, but there are bits and pieces that are hilarious and maybe even inspired. Not to mention, just like A Hard Day's Night, the film is backed by a brilliant soundtrack that only the Beatles could produce. But you know what's even more ridiculous than the film itself? What was going on behind the scenes? Tax fraud, vindictive royalty, beautiful women with syringes of heroin. It all sounds made up, but it isn't. This is the world the Beatles inhabited. Today, we will cover each and every one of these stories. The making of the film Help, and of course, the music that backed it. The music that marked another clear evolution in the Beatles' sound as they relentlessly took hold of the musical landscape and continued to bloom into one of the most influential bands in modern history. But first, a word from our sponsor. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform. Whatever your goals may be, Squarespace can help you accomplish them. From the jump, I was impressed by their design tools. We're talking templates, color palettes, visual design effects, all of which make it incredibly easy to create a stylish website in just a few clicks. And if you're like me and want to continue to make it your own, you can do just that with flexible drag and drop editing, custom pictures, and just about everything else you could want. If you're running a business, Squarespace allows you to address whatever needs you may have, such as their Acuity scheduling software, which makes booking and managing appointments stress-free. Looking to sell content? Whether it's classes, blogs, videos, or memberships, Squarespace allows you to paywall your work, set fees or subscription prices, and forget all the rest. Head to squarespace.com/makingofthebeatles for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use offer code MAKINGOFTHEBEATLES to save 10% off your first purchase of website or domain. Back to the video. When the Beatles signed on with production company United Artists in the fall of 1963, they did so for 3 films. So as you can imagine, once A Hard Day's Night began raking in money hand over fist, United Artists immediately set to work on production for the next film. The working title at that time was 8 Arms to Hold You. Yeah, I know I dissed the film's entire premise, but with a little context, it begins to make a bit more sense. First off, it's a clear satire of the James Bond films, which at the time were an absolute sensation. So it's not like it came totally out of left field. Plus, the Beatles had influence on some of the more radical locations and scenes.
So then things went a little bit awry, I think, because what happened then was we started saying, well, we've never been to the Bahamas, could you write that in?
Oh, I have got...
More on that later. Let's rapid-fire recap what took place in the months preceding Help. In September of 1964, the Beatles finished their first proper tour of the United States. It went exactly like you'd think. If you want to hear about that, I already have a video on it. But be warned, it's one of my earliest, so the voiceover is rough, and there are a few factual errors. But if you're interested, it's in the top left corner. After that, they polished off Beatles for Sale before launching back into their never-ending assault on the UK. In early December, Ringo finally had his pesky tonsils removed, so as to avoid any more Jimmy Nickel debacles. George and Patty vacationed in the Bahamas for a specific reason, which again, we'll get into later. Late December and most of January was composed of the now annual Beatles Christmas shows. At the end of January, John, Cynthia, and George Martin all vacationed in the Swiss Alps, where they went skiing. Sound a little familiar? On February 11th, Ringo married his longtime girlfriend, Maureen. Yay, Ringo. After all of this, it was finally time to return to the studio.
Ticket to Ride, take 1.
That would.
Okay.
Along with I Feel Fine, I consider Ticket to Ride to be one of the more significant leaps in the Beatles' early stylistic evolution. The sounds and the tones are distinctly different from what came before. They're heavier and indicative of the direction that pop music was headed.
Ticket to Ride.
That's me. That was one of the earliest heavy metal records made, I think.
Now, I think John's exaggerating a bit here, but regardless, he highlights my point. The origins of the song are a bit murky, both in the writing and the potential meaning of that phrase, ticket to ride. John claims that the lyrics and music were almost solely his own, while Paul considers it to be much more collaborative. And it has been Paul that has perpetuated one potential meaning. Paul would say, "John and I always liked wordplay, so the phrase, 'she's got a ticket to ride,' of course referred to riding on a bus or train. But, if you really want to know, it also referred to the ride on the Isle of Wight, where my cousin Betty and her husband Mike were running a pub. It was great fun to visit them, so John and I hitchhiked down to ride, and when we wrote the song, we were referring to the memory of this trip." But then you have Don Short, a journalist who was an acquaintance of the Beatles, recalling the following. "The girls who worked the streets in Hamburg had to have a clean bill of health, and so the medical authorities would give them a card, saying they didn't have a dose of anything. I was with the Beatles when they went back to Hamburg in June 1966, and it was then that John told me that he had coined the phrase, 'a ticket to ride,' to describe these cards. He could have been joking. You always had to be careful with John like that, but I certainly remember him telling me that." The song is driven by an ostinato, meaning a continually repeated musical phrase or rhythm. In this manner, it's very similar to the riff in I Feel Fine. Which itself was inspired by Bobby Parker's Watch Your Step. Later in the year, you'd see them deploy a similar tool in Day Tripper, so it was clearly a technique they were drawn to during this period. It was also during this time that the Beatles began to lean far more heavily on overdubs, recording aspects of the song separately and superimposing them on top of the basic rhythm track. This is exactly what they did for Ticket to Ride. In a bit of foreshadowing of future practices, Paul apparently directed Ringo as to what drum pattern to play.
Paul's contribution was the way Ringo played the drums.
Which, credit to you, Paul, it's fantastic. Later in the day, they would tackle Paul's Another Girl, a song he had written earlier in the month, whilst on vacation in Tunisia with Jane Asher. To finish off the day, they began work on George's I Need You, which was the very first Harrison original recorded since 1963's Don't Bother Me. Though they began work today, recording the basic backing, the song would not really come into form until the next day.
You don't realize how much I need you. 1, 2, 3, 4. If you The Beatles picked up right where they left off. They overdubbed vocals, cowbell, and then perhaps the most integral piece of the song. George's 12-string Rickenbacker, played using a volume pedal. Well, actually, maybe not. George would later say, "There was a guy in Liverpool who used to go to school with Paul and I. He had a volume pedal, and I think we tried that, but I could never coordinate it. So some of those, what we'd do is, I played the part, and John would kneel down in front of me and turn my guitar's volume control." So there you have it. Forget the volume pedal, and imagine John on his knees, turning a dial. They would then utilize the same technique for Yes It Is.
Take 3.
Ready to go now. 1, 2, 3, 4.
An admitted This Boy ripoff that is nonetheless striking.
Yes, it is.
That's me trying to rewrite This Boy, but it didn't work.
The song featured 3-part harmonies, which proved very challenging. In all, they would spend around 3 hours perfecting the vocals.
For red is the color that my baby wore, and what's more, it's true. Yes, it is.
It's the night before.
The day began with Paul's The Night Before, a song that was knocked out incredibly quickly. It features a Hohner electric piano, an instrument and sound never before utilized on a Beatles recording, but one that appears frequently throughout Help. Next came, surprisingly, another George Wright with
You Like Me Too Much.
Though you've gone away this morning, you'll be back again.
While there is plenty to appreciate about this track, it does feel awkward at points.
'Cause you like me too much and I like you.
It again features electric piano, and it was Paul who contributed the intro and coda. You've Got to Hide Your Love Away is one song that Beatles fans love to disagree on, specifically the inspiration and meaning of the song. Though probably just a loud minority, I had quite a few fans disagree when I said that I align with the theory that it is a song about hiding your sexuality, your love, from a society that deems it immoral. Brian Epstein was gay. While this was something that all of those close to him knew, it was also a fact that he would never declare publicly. Already in his life, Brian had been subject to persecution and assault as a result of his sexuality. John was by far the closest to Brian, and while he would say some pretty nasty things about him later in life, there was no other Beatle more empathetic toward Brian than John. John himself never confirmed this meaning, but Beatles biographer Hunter Davies, who I consider very reliable, claimed that John admitted to him privately that it was a song about Brian. Those who disagree with this theory will cite the fact that the pronoun she is used throughout the song, as if that is not a decision John would make to avoid public scrutiny. In my mind, the other theories just don't make any sense. One of these is that it's a song about an affair, and then another, even worse theory, is that it is about John having to hide his marriage with Cynthia from the public. Besides the fact that John's marriage to Cynthia was beyond public knowledge at this point. All one has to do is actually read the lyrics to realize that neither of these interpretations make any sense. But at the end of the day, the music can mean whatever you want. The song is clearly influenced by Bob Dylan, as acknowledged by John himself.
You've got to hide your love away.
That's me in my Dylan period again.
This song was the very first to utilize a session musician, a practice that would become very commonplace as the Beatles moved into the world of orchestral arrangements. This man was named Johnny Scott, and he contributed both tenor and alto flute. John and Paul always went out of their way to write a song for Ringo, and their attempt this time was If You've Got Trouble. It became pretty clear early on that the song was not a strong one. It ended up in the scrap heap. Capping off the day was Tell Me What You See, which to be honest, is one of the few Beatles songs that I completely forget exist. While You're Gonna Lose That Girl doesn't have much substance, it is carried by its melody and energy.
You're gonna lose that girl.
1, 2, 3. You're gonna lose that girl. Yes, you're gonna lose that girl. You're gonna lose.
Really, it is just a tremendously fun song to listen to. It was a John and Paul co-write, written inside of John's Weybridge home. Today, the song was just in its infancy, missing many of the elements that make it unique, such as Ringo's bongos. February 20th marked the last day of recording before the Beatles would depart to the Bahamas. Most of the work today was done in the control room by the engineers, as they worked on mixing the songs that had recently been recorded. The only new music laid down was That Means a Lot, another filler track that wouldn't make the album. Then, on February 22nd, the Beatles boarded a plane to the Bahamas, and it is from here that things will start to get a whole lot stranger. First off, why the Bahamas? Maybe just the climate, right? February in London is not exactly paradise. Might as well get in some sunshine while you film. But this was not why the Bahamas were chosen. So why then? Simply put, tax evasion. Already, Brian Epstein and the Beatles were beginning to feel the squeeze of the tax man. Their enterprise had grown at an unprecedented rate, and they were, as you could imagine, bringing in shitloads of money. Money which was being taxed at an incredibly high percentage. So, rather than keeping on the straight and narrow, Brian immediately got to work scheming with accountants on how best to hide their income. Thus, a plan was devised. accountant Dr. Walter Strack was sent to live in the tax haven of the Bahamas, where he was to establish residence and set up a tax shelter for the Beatles. So this is why George and Patty vacationed in the Bahamas earlier in the year to check in on Walter, and why the Beatles chose to film there now. Their fees for appearing in the film were £25,000 each, or around $600,000 today. A fee that was to be paid during their time in the Bahamas, so that they could immediately stow it away in Walter's bank account, safe from the British government. If this all sounds a bit harebrained and poorly thought out, it is because it was. Ringo would later say the following: "We went into one mad scheme where we paid a guy to go and live in the Bahamas and hold our money for us so it would be tax-free, and in the end we had to bring all the money back, pay the taxes on it, and pay this guy, so we might as well have just left it where it was." Unlike nearly every stop they had made to date, the Beatles were not here to perform, to conduct press, greet fans, or any such obligation. And immediately, this made people upset. On their arrival at the airport, a riot nearly broke out, as rather than indulging in the reception as they normally did, the Beatles quickly exited the plane and were immediately whisked away in a car. Fans and press had been barricaded by local officials, a point that Brian Epstein made sure to emphasize when the Beatles were accused of ignoring their fans. The tensions only grew. In a local newspaper, a headline read, "Beatles love Bahamas, but feeling far from mutual." The Beatles' behavior here is generally resented. They've refused to pose for any photographers, and fans have been unable to get autographs as the entertainers rush back and forth in fast cars and dodge autograph seekers. Photographers have been subjected to foul language, and the public generally has come in for similar treatment. There were accusations too. A local restaurant manager claimed that Ringo Starr had burned him with a lit cigarette. The Beatles' publicist, Tony Howard, would address the claim with the following: "When I told Ringo about it, he went into a fit of laughter, saying he couldn't understand how anyone would think he could do such a thing. The whole thing was such a joke." Howard admitted that Ringo did gesture toward the manager's hand with the cigarette, but he said he had no intentions of burning him. Perhaps the Beatles' lack of sociability could be partially attributed to one fact: they were high out of their minds, and this time, not on uppers that made them talkative and energetic, but on marijuana, introduced to them by the one and only Bob Dylan. The Beatles thing had just gone beyond comprehension, John would say. "We were smoking marijuana for breakfast. We were well into marijuana, and nobody could communicate with us because we were just all glazed eyes, giggling all the time, in our own world." Now, while that sounds like a bucket of fun for the Beatles, it was definitely not as fun for the film's director, Dick Lester. During the making of A Hard Day's Night, he had dealt with the Beatles coming in hungover, or on rare occasions, one of them not showing at all. But for the most part, once on set, the Beatles were engaged and reasonably professional. Not this time though. Ringo would recall, "Dick Lester knew that very little would get done after lunch. In the afternoon, we very seldom got past the first line of the script. We had such hysterics that no one could do anything." Now, marijuana wasn't the only drug floating around on the island of NASA. It is not at all unusual for users of hard drugs to attempt to persuade others to join them, as a means of growing closer, or sometimes as a means of exerting control. Dick Lester would recall the following incident: "I saw it happen to Paul McCartney once, the most beautiful girl I've ever seen, trying to persuade him to take heroin. It was an absolutely chilling exercise in controlled evil. Paul was no stranger to temptation. He turned her down. And there was even more darkness simmering in the background." On March 7th, the Beatles filmed the scene in which they flee through a dilapidated building. Without prior knowledge, you might assume that that was exactly what this space was. An abandoned army barrack, perhaps. Something of the sort. That's what the Beatles had assumed too, until they went inside. The building was not abandoned, as it was a hospital for disabled peoples. The conditions were horrific, and the Beatles were disgusted. The local government was not ignorant to the Beatles' intentions in the Bahamas, specifically their financial ones, so there were some stipulations put in place. The Beatles had to play the game. This meant attending a dinner at the NASA government house, where they were to meet and engage with the most powerful figures in the country. The meeting would not go well at all, As we all know, in the coming years, John Lennon would become something of an activist, speaking very critically of a number of governments and other institutions. Many have called his efforts performative and hypocritical. And while I have to agree in some part, I think that it's a lot more gray than that. And here's a perfect example. During this dinner, John, rather than keep quiet and play his part, angrily confronted the officials. His experience in the rundown hospital had disturbed and infuriated him. And here he was, sitting down with the very people who had allowed it. Lennon really tore into this guy, Lester would recall.
Sitting with the governor of the Bahamas because we're making help and being insulted by these fucking jumped up middle class bitches and bastards who would be commenting on our working classness, and our manners. And I was always drunk like the typical, whatever it is, insulting them. I couldn't take it. It hurt me, so I would go insane, swearing at them and whatever. I'd always do something, I couldn't take it. It was awful,
The Beatles' time in the Bahamas would end on March 10th as they flew back to Heathrow Airport in London. But it was right back to filming, and this time in a far different location, the snowy peaks of the Alps. On the evening of March 18th, an extraordinary event would take place. John and Paul would leave the hotel and hop on over to another hotel, the Marietta, where a band called Jackie and the Strangers were performing. Now their lead man, Jackie, claims that he had opened for the Beatles in Hamburg in 1960, though, in my opinion, this is probably not true. Just based on the records we do have, and the fact that Jackie's recollection seems less than reliable, seeing as he said they were called the Silver Beatles, when in fact, they dropped that name before leaving for Hamburg. But it is possible that John and Paul had heard of the group before. Jackie and the Strangers had been a Berlin staple, and had played in Hamburg, regardless of whether or not they played alongside the Beatles. So maybe this was why John and Paul stopped by, or maybe they just thought it would be funny. The story goes like this. John and Paul turned up, and immediately set to taking over the stage. They began jamming, with John cranking the volume on his amp, leading to the manager putting an end to the performance, complaining of the volume, and of the fact that he had booked Jackie, not the Beatles. Either this guy was oblivious, or he was the biggest Jackie and the Strangers fan in the world. I have to say, of all the sequences shot in Austria, my favorite is undoubtedly the scene featuring the one and only Mal Evans.
Excuse me, White Cliffs of Dover? Thank you.
After a busy 8 days in Austria, the Beatles would return to London and begin filming at Twickenham Studios, where the bulk of the film's interior scenes were shot. And it was around this time that an extremely important event took place. On an unknown date, during this very month of March, John, George, Cynthia, and Patty were all unknowingly dosed with a new kind of drug, LSD. I'll let John tell the story.
A dentist in London laid it on George, me, and our wives without telling us at a dinner party at his house. He was a friend of George's and our dentist at the time. And he just put it in our coffee or something, He was saying, I advise you not to. He didn't know what it was. There was just a sort of, it's all the thing, with the sort of the middle class London swingers or whatever. I hadn't all heard about it, and they didn't know it was different from pot or pills. And they gave us it, and he was saying, I advise you not to leave, and we thought he was all trying to keep us for an orgy in his house, and we didn't want to know, this was a dinner, and we got out and went, and this guy came with us. He was nervous. He didn't know what we were going crackers, I mean, it was insane going around London on it, and we thought when we went to the club, we thought it was on fire, and then we thought it was a premiere. Oh no, we thought it was a premiere. It was just an ordinary light outside. We thought, shit, what's going on here, And we were cackling in the street, and then People were shouting, let's break a window. We were just insane. And then we went to the ad-lib and all that. And then some singer came up to me and said, can I sit next to you? And I was going, only if you don't talk. Because I just couldn't think. I was pretty stunned, for a month or two.
It's time to skip ahead a little bit to April 5th, a day that would change George's life forever, as well as having a significant impact on the Beatles' music. The scene shot this day took place inside of an Indian restaurant and featured a backing band composed of Indian musicians. And one of the instruments played was, of course, the sitar, which George immediately took an interest in. Beyond being an introduction to a new sound, this instrument also seemingly triggered a chain of coincidences that eventually resulted in George's adoption of Hindu faith. I remember picking up the sitar and trying to hold it and thinking, this is a funny sound, George said. It was an incidental thing, but somewhere down the line I began to hear Ravi Shankar's name. The third time I heard it, I thought, this is an odd coincidence. And then I talked with David Crosby of the Byrds, and he mentioned the name. I went and bought a Ravi record. I put it on, and it hit a certain spot in me that I can't explain, but it seemed very familiar to me. The only way I could describe it was, my intellect didn't know what was going on, and yet this other part of me identified with it. It just called on me. But on this day, he simply found himself enchanted by the sound of the instrument, and felt that it was something he may want to explore sometime in the future. I know I haven't been presenting much as far as the actual timeline of filming goes, but I had to bring up the scene shot today, on April 8th, wherein Ringo has an encounter with a modified hand dryer. I just think it's so funny. Speaking of funny, it's time to bring up a little oddity. On April 10th, the Beatles would appear on the TV program Top of the Pops, where they were mimed, performing Ticket to Ride and Yes It Is. This would mark the debut of their fawn-colored jackets, most well known from their Shea Stadium performance. But even more interesting than that is the fact that this recording was integrated into an episode of Doctor Who, and in fact, it was initially planned to put the Beatles in old age makeup as a tie-in to the episode, though Brian wasn't keen on the idea. The only reason this clip exists is because of said Doctor Who episode. The original Top of the Pops episode was wiped long ago. Still to this day, Help stands out as a sterling example of John Lennon's songwriting. It's a shockingly vulnerable song, and quite literally, a cry for help. On the timeline of all of John's creations, it is undoubtedly one of the most important. So what if I told you that really, the song was just a bit of homework? Yup. Just like A Hard Day's Night, Help was a song that John was assigned to write. Well, boys, we've settled on Help for the title of the film, Dick Lester might have said, so scurry on and write the title track, okay? So John did just that, and it was that one word, help, that served as the impetus, that triggered an outpouring from John, as if he had been given permission to let it out. And perhaps we owe just a bit of the songwriting to journalist Maureen Cleave.
I remember Maureen Cleaver, a writer, the one who did the famous Jesus story in the Evening Standard. She said to me, why don't you ever write more than songs with more than one syllable in the word? So I wrote in Help as a 2 or 3 syllable words, and I very proudly showed it to her, and she didn't like them.
The song is almost all John, though Paul, of course, helped bring everything together and polish it off, as was usually the case. John has never expressed anything but disdain for the actual recording of the song. Help was conceived as a ballad, but that would never work for the film. Just like A Hard Day's Night, it had to be driving and frenetic. And it's not like the Beatles had time to fuss over the arrangement. They barely had any time at all. Just one day, in fact. So it was as simple as, okay, let's just speed it on up and get on with it. Though that's not to say that it's lacking musically. The harmonies and backing vocals are incredibly unique, harmonically and rhythmically. Quoting musicologist Alan Pollack here, the backers fascinatingly alternate between adding points of bold font-like emphasis to the lead part with chordal doubling, and providing a form of melodic counterpoint in which both the words and notes they sing subtly intertwine and overlap with the lead.
When I was young, was so much younger than today, I never needed anybody's help.
it was time to leave the stuffy confines of Twickenham Studios and to again shoot on location. This time, the frigid plains of Wiltshire. The weather was less than ideal. This 3-day stint of filming was not particularly fun.
Were you telling lies?
Okay, I absolutely adore this sequence, and especially the set. The Beatles filmed this scene on May 7th, once more at Twickenham. It's so simple, but has such a wonderful effect. On May 9th, the Beatles would attend a Bob Dylan show at the Royal Albert Hall, though the real fun occurred afterward, as a fever-dream lineup of 60s icons all inhabited the same space. Along with the Beatles and Bob, there were Alma Cogan, a woman who Cynthia suspected John of having had an affair with.
Oh, I know. How about playing Tennessee Waltz by Alma Warren?
And then, famed beat poet, Allen Ginsberg. The story goes that the atmosphere in the room was a bit awkward until Ginsberg, perched on the arm of a sofa, toppled into John's lap and jestingly asked him if he knew who William Blake was. John, being John, said no, though Cynthia immediately called him out. "Oh, John, you liar. Of course you have." After a quick hang, and I presume lots of weed smoking, the group would go out clubbing. Apparently, they got on well enough, as we will now jump ahead to June 3rd, the day of Allen Ginsberg's 39th birthday. John, Cynthia, George, and Patty all turned up, having been invited by mutual friend Barry Miles. The Beatles are no strangers to debaucherous scenes, but they still found themselves shocked on their arrival to the party. They were greeted by a piss-drunk and completely nude Allen Ginsberg. Well, almost completely nude, as he had the decency to hang over his penis, a sign reading, "Do not disturb." Now the group was polite, gave their greetings, but then made their way to the door. Barry Miles stopped them, asking why they were leaving so quickly, and John replied, "You don't do that in front of birds," referring, of course, to Allen Ginsberg's waving dick. Production for Help was wrapping up, which for the Beatles meant that it was time to get their butts back into the studio. Monday, June 14th would prove to be a day of legend for Paul McCartney, as he would record a trio of songs, those being I'm Down, I've Just Seen a Face, and Yesterday. Let's start with I'm Down. It was written to be exactly what it was, a rocker, a song to play on stage. It was a simple song to record, and they finished it off in 7 takes.
Let's hope this one turns out pretty darn good, huh? You tell lies thinking I can see. You can...
Originally called Anti-Gin Song, due to her liking for it, I've Just Seen a Face is a brilliant track. I was quite pleased with it, said Paul. The lyric works. It keeps dragging you forward. It keeps pulling you to the next line. There's an insistent quality to it that I liked. Last, and certainly not least, is Yesterday. Look, you all know I love being thorough, but I have to imagine each and every one of you have heard the origin story of the song about 1,000,000 times, so I'll spare you here. What I can tell you, though, is that because of this song, Paul just about drove everyone crazy during their time filming Help. This occurred first in the Bahamas, as whenever there was a guitar in his hands, he would strum the song incessantly, trying to work out the lyrics for what was then deemed scrambled eggs. This continued into Twickenham, with Dick Lester saying, "It got to the point where I said to him, if you play that bloody song any longer, I'll have the piano taken off stage. Either finish it or give up." The song was totally unlike any Beatles song to date. First off, Paul is the only Beatle to appear on the track, so today, only 2 components of the song were put down on tape. Paul's vocal and guitar, recorded simultaneously.
Yesterday, take 1.
I'm in G, but it'll be in F. It goes E minor.
Up next was John's It's Only Love, a beautiful song with pretty weak lyrics, which John himself would agree with.
It's Only Love?
It's Only Love Is Mine, I always thought it was a lousy song. Yes. Yeah, but the lyrics were abysmal. You know? I always hated that song.
The distinctive guitar sound that opens the song was accomplished by adding tremolo to George's 12-string Rickenbacker. It was time to record the orchestral overdubs for Paul's Yesterday. Fun fact though, for a short period, Paul considered working with BBC Radiophonic Workshop for the score, which if you aren't aware, was the BBC's sound effects unit and early pioneers of electronic music. In some alternate reality, there is a version of Yesterday with a Doctor Who style backing. Despite going forward, Paul was still apprehensive of utilizing an orchestra, fearing it would be too syrupy, and he attempted to direct the musicians to play without vibrato, which frankly is nearly impossible. They did their best to tone it down though, and the end result was satisfactory. In a demonstration of his continually budding brilliance, Paul actually contributed bits and pieces to George Martin's score, with Martin recalling, "Paul worked with me on the score, putting the cello here and the violin there. There's one particular bit which is very much his, and I wish I'd thought of it, where the cello groans on to the seventh the second time around." He also liked the idea of holding the very high note on the first violin in the last section. To be honest, I thought that was a bit boring.
Easy game to play. I need a play.
Paul also chose to re-record his vocal, and it was this second attempt that was chosen as the best, though his first vocal had bled ever so slightly into the guitar recording done on the 14th, causing a subtle doubling on his vocal throughout the song. The day's work was not finished, because it was now time for the even more superb Act Naturally, a cover song, and Ringo's token track for the LP. The day was finished with... Wait, isn't that a Rubber Soul track? Why this song was left off Help is unknown. It feels like it could replace a cover like Dizzy Miss Lizzy, at the very least. But maybe they just ran out of time, because in just 3 days, they would be leaving for Paris, marking the beginning of a 2-week stint in France and Italy. And not only that, they were only 3 months away from recording another album, a landmark album, one that, at the expense of being cliché, would change everything. That story, next time, on the making of the Beatles. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and if you would like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. These videos are released every 2 weeks, but do you want to watch the next video right now? You can do so by joining my Patreon for only $1 a month. Once again, thank you so much. Until next time.